Welcome to the 2022 DiLCo Lecture Series on Digital Language and Communication. I'm Yanis Androutsopoulos from the University of Hamburg. DiLCo is a 3-year scientific network on digital language variation in context, initiated in 2021. It's coordinated by my colleague Heike Zinsmeister, who cannot be here today, and myself at the University of Hamburg, and currently includes scholars from universities in the US, UK, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Denmark. DiLCo is generously supported by the University of Hamburg within the Universities of Excellence scheme, funded by the German federal government and federal states. DiLCo aims to stimulate scientific exchange between various approaches to digital language and communication research within linguistics and to bridge gaps between qualitative and quantitative methods. To this purpose, we are organizing online and on-site activities such as conference panels, methods workshops, and the DiLCo Lecture Series. These lectures showcase cutting-edge international research by senior and younger scholars who draw on key concepts in social cultural linguistics, including community, context, identity, interaction, multimodality, and linguistic change, to shed light on digital communication. We are recording these lectures, as we do today, to build up a repository that will be available open access from Hamburg University's video portal Lecture2Go. Visit our website for more information. As in the past, each lecture is about 40 minutes followed by discussion. Feel free to post questions and comments into the chat during the lecture. We'll take them up in the discussion time. And in addition, in today's lecture, there's going to be a handout that will be distributed via the chat field in a minute. I'm now delighted to introduce today's speaker, Katharina König from the University of Münster in Germany. Katharina is a lecturer in German linguistics and a scientific coordinator of the Center for Language and Interaction at the university's German department. Katharina obtained her doctoral degree from Münster University in 2013 with a language biographic study of language attitudes and multilingualism, published as a monograph in 2014. In the following years, she carried out research on mobile messaging interaction and on grammar and interaction, with a focus on the use of discourse markers in everyday spoken conversation, as well as in everyday text and voice messaging. Parts of her data have been integrated into the Mobile Communication Database, a web-based corpus of messaging data that is widely used in German-speaking research. Katharina has edited several volumes and special issues in English and German, including a special issue on adapted and emergent practices in text-based digital discourse. This is in Discourse, Context and Media 2021, co-edited with Michael Marmorstein, and a special issue on mobile media practices from 2020 in the Journal of Media Linguistics, co-edited with Florence Olof. Her work has also appeared in Journal of Pragmatics, Discourse and Communication, and other venues. What is special, I think, about Katharina's approach to digital language and communication research is the way she applies concepts and methods from multimodal conversation analysis to the study of mediated interaction, and in particular to the relationship between text and voice messages in mobile communication. This is also the topic of Katharina's talk today on transmodal messenger interactions. Thank you, Katharina, for being here. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction and, of course, the invitation. I'm really honored to be part of this lecture series. In my talk, I want to introduce and discuss the notion of transmodal interaction by focusing on WhatsApp voice messages and how users integrate them in messaging chats, which are largely text-based. In linguistic research, messenger chats have long been described as multimodal, and the term usually refers to the integration of emojis, hyperlinks, or images into text-based dialogues. However, the introduction of voice messaging to posting-based digital communication has changed the game profoundly, as it allows users to combine written and spoken language in a single chat interface in new and unprecedented ways. With my study, I hope to offer some innovative perspectives on how chatters make use of the range of modal resources that messaging apps afford. Building on a corpus of German WhatsApp chats, the talk will address how users establish sequential coherence between text and audio postings. I want to highlight how choice of modality is utilized as a resource. That is, I'd like to show that users associate text and voice messages with different semiotic potentials. This, I'll argue, is reflected in A, the ways in which text and voice messages are introduced to discourse, and B, the actions or projects that users pursue with either text or voice messages. I'll start by shortly reviewing the social media discourse about voice messages before I introduce the concept of transmodal interaction. I'll then address some methodological issues in the collection and curation of voice messaging data. And my subsequent analysis is twofold. I'll first address the question how chatters make use of the semiotic qualities that voice messages afford. I'll then turn to a sequential analysis of transmodal WhatsApp chats, and the conclusion will highlight relevant directions for future research. Voice messages repeatedly attract public interest. Newspaper articles discuss their pros and cons. There's an abundance of memes and visual statements in social media that point out and comment on communicative practices associated with audio postings. I'd like to start out by briefly focusing on a selection of memes and visual statements that can illustrate current media ideologies about voice messaging. First of all, memes frame voice messages as a typical feature of today's mobile messaging, as you can see in the depiction on this slide. It suggests that they have replaced text postings completely. Now, we know that memes and visual statements like these are discourse objects that work with linguistic creativity and overstatement. So we know that we are not to take them as descriptions or depictions of how things actually are, but rather as an iconic or exaggerated take on media practices. Yet for this particular meme to work, there has to be a grain of truth in what it depicts. So in this case, users actually register voice messages as a new contribution format, which is gaining momentum. Despite this assumed growing popularity, social media discourse revolving around voice messaging is in large parts defined by criticisms of this practice. Overwhelmingly, memes comment on the length of voice messages, and it's often framed as too long. So in the first meme, we even see a contrast with another digital audio genre, the podcast, or they are presented as hard to process. The contrast between what users say they want to do and what they end up doing is highlighted in the third example. Here we also get an idea of what too long actually means, a message which is several minutes, in this case even 6 minutes long. Memes also refer to the content of voice messages. They often said to have no real point or communicative intent. Or speakers take up quite an amount of time to talk about rather dull everyday experiences, as pointed out in the third example, which refers to a voice message whose overall gist it is that someone's toast got burnt. So we see how the issue of pointlessness is actually associated with rather long messages. Moreover, we encounter assessments, either in the facial gestures of the depicted media persona or in the hashtags, like the one we see in the last visual statement, these fucking voice messages. Also, the fact that people actually choose voice messages rather than other modes of communication is picked up in meta discourse. All in all, those voice notes are characterized as inconvenient and disturbing. We see, for example, Batman reprimanding Robin, ordering him to use texting, which reflects an idea of a default or normal mode of messaging. Voice notes can cause trouble for the receiver, as they might not be played in public with unaddressed overhearers. We also see processes of iconization, that is, an association of certain media practices with particular user groups, as can be seen in the last example. Here, people who use voice messages are met with explicit degradation. What these memes and visual statements have in common is that they capture the addressee's perspective, that is, receiving and having to listen to messages which are conceived of as too long and pointless is framed as an annoying media practice. Yet some memes also refer to issues that users encounter while producing a message. They allude to the advantages of the oral modality from the sender's point of view. Voice messages are easier to produce in contrast to laborious typing. The first meme too establishes an iconic link between the practice and typified users. So people who use voice messages are depicted as not making an effort and who cannot pull themselves together, which is also reflected in the bear's composure. The second meme comments on the non-visibility of the message's content as an advantage. So voice notes are not easily shareable and not as accessible as text messages. What we also see in the meta discourse on voice messaging is the typification of particular linguistic practices or expressions. At least in German memes, certain discourse markers are identified as typical for this posting type. So like in the first one, also, associated with the opening of voice messages, and a lengthened und your representing a closing marker. In English memes, the hesitation marker is referred to repeatedly. So speaking in voice messages is presented as somewhat unplanned, uncoordinated, with no predefined way of starting and ending the recording process. In the paper I referenced here, I conducted an empirical study which shows that while these markers do occur in some of the voice messages, they do not appear in all or even the majority of cases. So we see here a process that some forms are highlighted as typical while other forms are ignored. And from a language ideological perspective, this process could be termed erasure. What we can infer from this glimpse into social media discourse is that voice messaging is not innocent. It's a practice which is embedded in a network of media ideologies, in this case of circulating ideas about the indexicality of mode choice. Voice messages come with an emotional load, ranging from a humorous negotiation of their inconvenience for the receiver to an outright degradation of people who send voice messages. Despite this criticism, surveys repeatedly document the growing popularity of voice messages, and the analysis of user data clearly shows an increase in the amount of voice notes sent on a daily basis. So what is it that people do when they send voice messages? How do users integrate them in their daily communicative routines? Do they frame them as in some way special or in need of explanation? Or have voice messages already become an ordinary mode of contribution, just as text messages or shareable objects? Before I present observations from an ongoing research project about voice messaging in German WhatsApp chats, I would first like to introduce the notion of transmodal interaction. This adds another trans perspective, as Sender Dovkin has called it in the last DiLCo lecture, to current research on the multiplicity of social and communicative resources in digital spaces. The notion focuses on the use of different modal resources in digital communication and takes an interactional perspective informed by conversation analysis. Despite some advances, linguistic research of mobile messaging is still very much focused on visual resources, such as emojis, spelling, punctuation, image postings, and such. Some studies mention voice notes as a new possibility, such as Herring or Barron. Other studies use qualitative interviews with reflexive accounts about these media practices, like, for example, Kui. Yet they do not present corpus-based analyses of actual voice messages. In one chapter of the recent paper, Bush and Sindoni studied the meta discourse evolving around one voice message, but do not have access to the voice message itself. Other studies analyze code switching patterns in text and voice messages, but do not discuss the fact that they actually happen in different modalities in detail. So this documents that the linguistic analysis of voice messages is still sort of developing a suitable theoretical framework. The concept of transmodal interaction tries to capture the particularities of the integration of speech and writing in messenger communication, which so far has been described as multimodal. But we also have concepts of cross-modality. We also find multi-channel communication, and it's also related to the study of polymedia in interaction. So this terminological diversity too reflects that there's not yet a common understanding of the object under study. We rather find a plurality of perspectives on new forms of digital communication. With my take on transmodal interaction, I build on the 2018 paper by Yanis and Ster, in which they outline new methodological perspectives on the sociolinguistic study of everyday media use. One perspective concerns the use of several modal resources. So in their words, the proliferation of communication technologies enables interaction to be carried out in distinct modalities of language, speaking and typing, and or mediational tools, phones and keyboards, so that written and spoken utterances can complement each other in the sequential accomplishment of an activity. Central to my understanding of transmodal interaction is the focus on one single communicative activity. However, I do not take an interest in the question which platform people use for different activities, say WhatsApp for interactions with close friends and Facebook for staying in contact with remote friends. I'd like to narrow down this approach to a communicative activity which is accomplished in one technological environment, in my case, WhatsApp, to be able to focus on the impact that specific affordances have for the coordination of different modalities. So unlike polymedia perspectives, transmodal interaction focuses on the integrated use of different modalities on one single platform. Another relevant aspect this quote highlights is the sequentiality, that is the temporal unfolding of the activity under observation. So this is where a transmodal interaction perspective differs from multimodal discourse analysis, which usually focuses on the integration of different modes at the same time, as for example, in the study of the indexical relation between text and image in memes. Instead, transmodal interaction captures the temporal coordination of different modalities. Here I draw on conversation analysis and new approaches to digital CA to highlight that the exchange of text and voice messages is sequentially ordered. That is, comparable to turns in spoken conversation, successive postings build on one another. They make particular responses relevant or expectable. They document how a prior posting was understood, which results in a, at least largely coherent structure of temporally ordered conversations, contributions. Now, depending on the affordances of the platform, different configurations of transmodal interaction emerge. If you think of video conferencing via Skype or Zoom, users usually have written as well as the oral visual mode at their disposal. If you think of platforms like Twitch, they are characterized by an asymmetry of contribution modes. That is, the audio channel is open to the streamer alone. The audience can participate via text only. And this asymmetry is what Rosenbaum et al. Actually tried to capture with the notion of cross-modal communication. With WhatsApp, the platform affords a linear succession of postings, as you can see on the right-hand side. That is, all messages are represented in a visual temporal order on the screen protocol. I'll now turn to an empirical study on the sequential integration of voice messages. So let's start with an overview of the data I analyzed for this study. On the one hand, I used the mobile communication database, as mentioned by Yannis in his introduction, a searchable web-based corpus of private German messaging chats, which has been initiated by Michael Beiswenger and Wolfgang Imo in 2018, and which has been developed further together with Evelyn Ziegler and myself, and of course to mention the developer Marcel Fladrich. All data have been donated on a voluntary basis by users themselves. Names and other personal details are anonymized. Users are also asked to provide metadata concerning, for instance, the texter's age, the languages they use, their relationship, and other relevant context information. To date, this corpus resource comprises more than 800 different chats with approximately 37,000 individual messages of more than 3,000 users. Now, when it comes to shareable media, such as images, GIFs, videos, and voice messages, the database usually displays a placeholder, as you can see on the picture now, indicating the posting type and the timestamp. In this case, it's a voice message, and donators have the option to describe the content of the posting. Here it says Geburtstagsplanung, so Marie is talking about the organization of a birthday party. Some donators even provide short transcriptions, which, however, vary in the details they provide, and they often do not follow a particular transcription system. In this case, we only get a rough summary of what is said. The translation would be question how he, assumedly Moritz, organized his birthday party, description of my problems, unquote. Moreover, we do not get any information about the actual duration of the voice message, and further contextualization cues like intonation, voice quality also get lost. So the Mukuna is a rich resource for studying the discourse of German text messaging, which may surround the audio files and which may also entail meta-communication about voice messages. It's only recently that we have started to integrate transcriptions that adhere to CA standards. And we've also started to provide the original audio files along with the transcriptions. And I try to use this publicly available data in my talk whenever I could. However, much of the analysis is also based on a private collection of voice messages and the surrounding dialogues that I've been collecting since 2017. Here I tried to capture the different steps of the data collection process, which is also supposed to illustrate the methodological challenges one faces when working with this particular type of data. The process, of course, starts with the informed consent by all users involved, which may actually also entail people hearable in the voice messages, which do not participate in the chats themselves. The actual data collection then is twofold. On the one hand, one needs to secure the chat logs with the timestamps for each posting, and the audio files have to be saved and converted into workable format separately. In the next step, I also conducted ethnographic interviews with some of the users concerning their general use of WhatsApp and voice messaging and selected aspects of their chats. The next step involves the aligned transcription of the audio postings. My data are transcribed according to the GATT conventions, and I work with the Esmeralda partitur editor, which also enables me to annotate the data and mask the audio files when personal details are mentioned. The transcriptions can then be exported into various formats, which can be imported to the MOCO-DA, but of course only if the users have given their consent. So now let's go into the actual data. First, I'd like to show that and how voice messages are used for specific communicative actions or projects. I want to illustrate that chatters make use of particular semiotic qualities that come with the oral mode. This concerns prosodic resources of the speaker's voice as well as other hearable aspects of the situation. There's much to say about the oral design of voice messages, but I'll focus on three aspects. One is the expressiveness of the speaker's voice. They can use specific prosodic markup strategies to contextualize their talk. In the first example, and this is where you should actually make, could refer to the handout now if needed, the speaker, Michelle, answers her boyfriend's question when she will return home. And I'll play that to you twice now, and I hope that it's loud enough for you to hear. Of course, I know that not all of you have an active command of German, but here I'd like to ask you to, pay attention to the prosodic details.
Hallo, ich Nudli. Also doch, ich komme gleich nach Hause. Um 8 oder so, aber ich kann auch einfach Nudeln mit Pesto essen, das ist kein Problem.
Okay, I'll play it a second time, and please pay attention to the introduction and to the closing part.
Hallo, ich Nudli. Also doch, ich komme gleich nach Hause. Um 8 oder so, aber ich kann auch einfach Nudeln mit Pesto essen, das ist kein Problem.
So I hope that you've heard that in the introductory greeting, as well as in the last intonation phrase, the speaker uses a higher pitch register, lengthening of final syllables, lower tempo, lisping, and a particular voice quality, which adds a lamination of cuteness to her talk. So not only does she set off the opening and the closing parts from the core message, she also indexes a stance of commitment and affection towards her boyfriend. At the same time, she frames this voice message as private and intimate. So audio postings introduce an abundance of prosodic contextualization resources to digital messaging. From my data, it also emerges that there's a preference for complex communicative activities to be carried out in voice messages. This concerns longer explanations, the weighing of arguments, and detailed narrations of personal experience. Sometimes speakers even give an explicit account of why they choose a voice note as a mode of communication in the next, as for example, in the next example. We see in the screenshot that Michelle initiates the dialogue with a question, how Bene's football game was, and Bene then responds with a voice message, which he starts with a short account for this mode switch. And I'll just play the first part of the message.
Hallo Süße, Spielanalyse ist glaube ich mit der Sprachnachricht einfacher. Erste Halbzeit waren wir schon besser, hat er dann 3 gute Chancen gehabt. Bei einem kriegt er den Ball hoch rein.
All right, so what is of interest here is the account in line 2, where we get something like match analysis may be easier with the voice message. So in the given context with the alternative possibilities afforded by the platform, speech here is explicitly framed as the preferred choice when it comes to complex projects, which would not be easily doable in text messages. Here, writing is associated with laboriousness, while speaking is linked to a simple and straightforward way of interaction. In example 3, we hear speaker Sonja perform an everyday activity, boiling water.
Ah, dann warst du ja auch recht spät im Bett. Warte mal. Ich musste eben den Wasserhahn bedienen, weil ich mir einen Tee machen möchte, weil ich immer etwas zu wenig trinke im Moment. Das ist immer ein wenig blöd. Ich hoffe, du hast dann auch einigermaßen gut geschlafen.
Okay, Sonja first responds to Isabel's previous message in which Isabel has said that she went to bed after 10 p.m. She then pauses her response, and we can hear how she pours water from the sink. She gives a short account for this interruption, but then continues with her initial comment on Isabel's sleeping situation. The whole audio posting is 3.5 minutes long, and I'll spare you from listening to all of it. But suffice it to say that Sonja refers to her tea brewing project a few more times as the noise of the kettle is getting louder and louder in the background. And I hope you can hear that background noise in the 3 next snippets.
Jetzt muss ich hier so gegen den Wasserkocher anschreien. Wann ist der Tee hier noch haltbar? Ah, ein Monat abgelaufen, den kann man noch benutzen.
So, the last one.
So, ich trinke jetzt einen Wintertee, Schneewunder, Kirsche Marzipan.
So this is an example of how background noise is actually integrated into the speaker's current projects. The message is interspersed with references to a parallel and hearable activity. Speakers can choose to do otherwise. They can actually refrain from recording a voice message in these situations, or they can simply ignore the background noise, thus rendering it irrelevant, a practice which is also found in my data. So what is Sonja doing when she designs her audio posting in this way? She opens a window into her current situation. She chooses to present herself as right in the middle of a daily routine, which is another aspect in which voice messages are framed as intimate activities that one shares with friends. So what this shows about voice messaging is that chatters make use of the specific semiotic qualities of the oral mode for their projects. Users can stage audio postings as hearable performances or as dramas to an audience, to borrow a concept from Goffman. They choose a suitable stage. The messenger affords a choice of different contribution modes. They need to decide which mode is suitable for their project. As we saw in one user's account, voice messaging is associated with an easy and straightforward way to extensive tellings. Users arrange the scene by integrating the recording process in hearable everyday activities. They invite others into their lives. They style their speaking as a hearable performance with prosodic resources. They add a lamination of expressiveness or humor to their talk and frame their utterances as affectionate. And not to forget the audience, the audible dramas are clearly recipient designed. They are performances for specific addressees, be it in group chats or in dyadic chats. So with all the aspects mentioned so far, again, we see that users frame messages as personal or intimate modes of communication. Thus far, we've looked into the ways in which individual voice messages are designed and how this reflects how users perceive of the semiotic qualities of voice and text messaging. I'd now like to turn to the sequentiality of transmodal messenger interactions. That is, I'd like to highlight how voice messages are integrated into messaging chats and how sequential order is accomplished. There are different ways how one can go about this, as there are several dimensions along which sequential order can be analyzed. One concerns the units of action. This refers to the question, for example, how many voice messages chatters send in their projects and how these transmission units are structured internally. For instance, in my corpus, chunking, that is a series of 2 and more voice messages by the same user, is not very prominent. Rather, users aim at designing voice messages as a complete contribution. What is characteristic, though, is that voice messages usually deal with several lines of talk at the same time. And that's not surprising, usually in the longer ones. In terms of the spatiotemporal order, I seldomly find instances of disrupted adjacency in my corpus, that is, instances in which two subsequent audio postings by different users do not relate to each other as they have been produced at the same time. Chatters tend not to use voice messaging in highly interactional contexts. Discourse markers have long been studied in CA and in interactional linguistics, that is, expressions with which speakers contextualize how one discourse unit relates to another. In a first study, I could show that they are comparatively rare in text messages, but quite prominent in voice messages. Here, they are used to establish links across messages, irrespective of their modality, plus they are used to organize different lines of talk in one message and across different messages. Another dimension of sequentiality concerns mode alternation patterns, that is how users switch between text and voice messages. There are one-off voice nodes where just one audio posting is sent in an otherwise text-based chat. We sometimes find an alternation across users, that is, one chatter sends text messages while the other responds in audio postings, which may be due to personal preference or situational factors. We might also find a continuous mixing of text and voice messages, or an interaction which consists only of voice messages. So in this lecture, I will not conduct a small-scale sequential analysis of transmodal dialogues, which usually span across several postings with often very long audio postings that extend 1 minute at least. Instead, I'll focus on selected aspects of how voice messages are introduced into emerging messenger chats. So in order to understand how voice notes work as contributions to ongoing discourse, one needs to analyze how they refer to the foregoing discourse and how they shape the subsequent dialogue. Central to CA is a concept of conditional relevance that I draw on here. It takes the pairing of actions as its object and tries to capture the links between one action and a subsequent one. A first makes a second expectable. It can make certain kinds of action relevant. So for instance, an invitation invites an acceptance, but a first can also make certain formats expectable. A polar question prefers a yes/no answer. If there is no suitable second, then this absence is noted. A non-response to an invitation is heard as a rejection, and non-polar answers to polar questions can be understood as evasive. So how is conditional relevance established in transmodal messaging chats? Does it also extend to mode choice? That is, do users make responses in a certain mode relevant or expectable? Let's first look at one example that exemplifies a regular pattern in which voice messages are integrated into WhatsApp chats. It's taken from a dialogue between the two students, Amina and Pembe. In posting 95, Amina asks Pembe to bring the things, assumedly she refers to her notes from a previous lecture, which requires a response by Pembe. This response is then delivered via a voice message. Here we have the problem that the Mokoda does not supply a detailed transcription, yet we can gather from the short summary that Pembe indeed deals with Amina's request by pointing out when she will be on campus. This then triggers a follow-up question by Amina, who wants to know for how long Pembe will stay here. So we see that the audio posting is designed as a second to a first, and it's treated as an acceptable way of contributing to the ongoing chat in Amina's subsequent posting. One should, however, keep in mind that audio postings are not as accessible as text messages, even though they are permanently available on the Screen protocol. What is directly accessible is a play button, in addition to information about the user, the length of the message, and the timestamp, but not the actual content of the audio posting per se. So in the next example, we can see that this visual representation itself already makes a response relevant or expectable. Amina and Pembe continue their dialogue. Amina still tries to find out a time at which Pembe could hand over her notes. And Pembe replies again in an audio posting. The posting alone now is interpreted by Amina as a contribution that makes a somewhat immediate response relevant. But she explains that she cannot deal with the contents of the message right away. Instead, she accounts for her inability to reply meaningfully right away. She deals with the message's content in her subsequent posting, which is framed by the meta-communicative comment that she now has had the chance to listen to the voice message, again reflecting the expectation for a rather quick response. Only then does she find a reply to Pember's apology. Thus, response relevance in messaging interactions not only involves the delivery of a suitable responsive action in a format that is relatable to a first, it also entails the expectation to listen to the message within a certain amount of time once the voice message has been posted to the screen protocol. Now, I'd like to turn to the question if users actually make relevant a response in a certain modality. Usually, there's no explicit practice by which chatters indicate which mode they expect the answer to be cast in. If you look back at example 2 on your handouts, in which Michel asks Bene how his game was, one could argue that some firsts make a voice message expectable, as this question about a rather long event could make chatters require something in a voice message. But usually chatters are not required to answer in voice explicitly. Sometimes, however, we do get meta-communicative requests in WhatsApp chats to either send a text or a voice message, which might tell us something about how users perceive of the different modes of contribution. And to get a grasp on this, I searched the Mokoda for keywords, including different expressions for text and voice messages, and also for references to writing, sharing, sending, recording, reading, or listening. What I found was an abundance of references to writing, 305 on the whole, and among them more than 60 instances in which text messages are requested explicitly with the verb schreiben, to write, as the following examples illustrate. So we have something like, write when you have arrived, write to me in more detail once you'll be there. This documents that it's quite normal to request others to write and to share other media with them. So the same holds true for the requests to send something. So when I looked for the verb schicken, I also found quite many instances where people request that pictures would be sent to them. We see a different picture when it comes to the requests to send an audio posting. So I just found these two instances in the Mokoda, which explicitly ask for a voice note. So references to voice notes are quite rare in the Mokoda. But what I also found in addition is that they can be introduced by the senders. I found 3 instances in which chatters announced that they themselves will send a voice message. Sure. So it's actually them who makes them expectable, like in the next example. In posting 104, we find one of the 2 instances in which a user requests a voice message, for which Melissa accounts in her following message. So Anna has actually missed an appointment. Now Melissa requests that she should explain her personal story in a voice message at least 5 minutes long. In posting 107, Anna does not reply by delivering the voice message right away, but she promises to record one should she find the time. Only rarely do users express the expectation that others should respond in a voice message. This illustrates that voice and text messages are treated differently by chatters. Text messages are framed as the default and unmarked way of contribution, which is why they can be requested explicitly. However, it's largely left to the addressee to choose if he or she wants to respond in a voice message. It's treated as a matter of personal choice. Finally, I'd like to turn to the issue of mode switching in particular, and how users go about switching from text to audio. As I indicated earlier, there are various ways in which audio postings are integrated into the unfolding of WhatsApp chats. Once they have been established as a possible mode of contribution amongst users, voice messages can be designed and treated as just another legitimate way to contribute to discourse. If you, for example, go back to example number 4. Sometimes, however, these switches are flagged. For instance, when users account for their choice of the oral mode, such as being in example 2, in which he says that it's easier to present a match analysis in a voice message. In my data, I also found a rather implicit practice with which the mode switch from text to audio is framed as minimally accountable. Example 6 is taken from another dialogue between Bene and Michelle. It's taken place on Christmas, and Bene asks when Michelle and her family will open their presents. Michelle then answers, "This afternoon, why?" Which makes an account relevant, which Bene delivers in his voice message. I'll just play the first seconds of the message in which Bene offers details about his presents for Michelle.
Hallo, ich wollte nur kurz was zu dem Geschenk in der größeren Verpackung sagen.
Okay, just another one.
Hallo, ich wollte nur kurz was zu dem Geschenk in der größeren Verpackung sagen.
I was struck by the initial greeting "Hallo" in this message and asked myself, why that now? It's not Bene's first contribution to the dialogue, so it cannot be interpreted as an opener to a new encounter. Neither do we see a large time gap between messages 2 and 3. In fact, there is a near synchronous coordination between the two chatters at this point. In everyday conversations, greeting can open a focused interaction. They can check the addressee's availability, and they help to establish the mutual contact between the interlocutors. But this does not apply to this example, as the chatters have already started their dialogue. Michelle has already signaled her availability, plus the greeting is not reciprocated. So what does Bene do when he opens his message with "hello"? I'd like to argue that in the given context, this expression is reinterpreted as an implicit flagging of Bene switching from text to voice. It clearly does not account for this switch, yet it treats it as somewhat marked. So this is an interesting case which shows that it's worthwhile to take a closer look at the resemiotization that linguistic practices such as greetings undergo at the beginning of voice messages. This shows that starting from the actual practice of transmodal messaging gives us valuable insights into what it is that users think they are doing when they use voice messages, how they perceive of the semiotic resources that platforms afford, and how they adapt them for their communicative projects. So to conclude, we started out by looking at the social media discourse about audio postings, which gave us an initial idea that texting and voice messaging are not perceived as equal ways of contribution. I then introduced the notion of transmodal interaction to capture the particularities of the different modal resources in digital communication for one activity on a single platform in its sequential unfolding. In my analysis, I illustrated how chatters make use of the various semiotic resources that audio postings afford, most prominently prosody and background noise, which is used to design the postings as dramas to an audience. And finally, we looked at the sequential integration of voice messages and their framing, which suggests that the oral mode is rarely made relevant in WhatsApp chats, but sometimes explicitly as well as implicitly treated as accountable. I hope that my analysis shows that the spoken word has found its way into mobile messaging. At the same time, this glimpse into practices of transmodal interaction opens up various new fields of sociolinguistic and interactional linguistic inquiry. We've seen that audio postings are framed as personal and intimate contributions, which is why voice messaging lends itself to questions concerning the construction and negotiation of identity and its link to ideologies about media use. Some studies have already started to look into this, as for example, Alexander's and Venka's papers on mediated multilingualism, which also includes audio postings. Moreover, linguistic research could trace how genres are reconfigured, to take a term from Susan Herring, given the particular affordances of transmodal messaging, as it's already been described for narrations of personal experience in audio postings. But we might also see the emergence of totally new genres. The organization of discourse in transmodal interactions needs some attention, and the importance of discourse markers is already attested. Yet in what way they differ from discourse markers in spontaneous interactions is not yet clear. Here I'd like to refer to a study by Jana Channon at the University of Bern, who looks at practices of opening and closing in voice messages in more detail. What I presented today is clearly anchored in German voice messaging. While audio postings are quite popular in Germany, this does not extend to all languages and all cultures. Moreover, the affordances of different messenger platforms can differ. If you think, for example, of WeChat, the main messenger used in China, it does not allow voice messages longer than 60 seconds. So what we actually need is cross-linguistic and cross-platform research. Finally, one could also take a polymedia perspective on audio postings by looking at their production and reception in face-to-face conversations, again, to better understand how users themselves make sense of this particular mode of contribution in transmodal messaging. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katharina, for this very rich and fascinating talk. I'm trying to get, yes, to get the representation right. I think that should be right. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes for discussion. And I'm very happy we have already a number of chat comments. So what I would propose to do is to open the chat field and then take the comments in a series from the top to the bottom. I invite commenters, those who have written comments and questions in the chat field, to speak up and present their question if you want, else I will read it out for Katharina. The first one is by L. Schultz. I don't know by heart whom that might be. The question there is, I find it surprising that people are willing to listen to 1-hour podcast recorded by strangers, but yet impatient fast when an acquaintance sends them a 5-minute long voice message. What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, I'd say these are like completely different genres, but we have seen that they are actually connected, right? In one of the memes, it was actually mentioned, it's not a podcast, so please do not. I think the thing is the response relevance, I would say. So we are required to listen to these voice messages in order to be able to respond accordingly. That sort of imposes something like a force to listen closely. But in podcasts, of course, we can have like a receptive stance of, you might listen and then not listen the other second, and it doesn't matter. So you're not supposed to engage with the other with the other speakers. So I think that's what it makes so like annoying about these long voice messages. But of course, it's also a matter of, like, say, personal taste. What is long for you? So what is perceived as long? And it might also depend, say, on the actions that have to be accomplished in one voice message. So it's not to say that every message that's longer than 1 minute is perceived as long. So that's something what one also needs to keep in mind when looking at this. So what's the user's take on length?
Great. Thank you for this. Now we have the second one by Mazume, I see here. And the question there is, I'd like to know whether the use of the voice message could be related to the personality traits or not. Obviously.
Now, so that sort of involves the question, so why use voice messaging at all, right? And what I can see, so I collected a corpus of chats that include voice messages, but of course I know from the interviews that are also conducted that some people don't like them at all and don't use them at all, right? So it's not to say that everybody uses voice messaging in quite an extensive way. So that might be a matter of personal preference or personal choice. I'm not really sure about personality traits. That's something that, at least for me, would be hard to get a grasp on methodologically. But we do know that we have different ways how people actually make use of voice messaging.
Okay, then we have one by Sabina Perino. Sabina, are you there? Would you like to pose your question yourself? Of course, I can read it out, but if you're there and you would like to speak up, then you can do so. Then let's move on with the question. The question is, it would be interesting and fascinating to examine the cross-cultural dimension of voice notes in WhatsApp, which is what you concluded on, right? And the use of WhatsApp as a platform itself. In the US, for example, Sabina says, WhatsApp is not used that much. Voice notes are used rarely and through other phone apps or simply via iMessage of the Android messenger.
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm here.
Okay, take the floor. The floor is yours. Yes.
I just wanted to differentiate because I made a mistake. A typo. iMessage versus the Android corresponding messenger. that, you know, I'm not sure how it is called, but I noted that in the United States, really WhatsApp is not used, first of all. And then second, it's so interesting because voice notes are not used as, you know, we use them in Europe, for example, because, you know, I'm Italian, and so I have a lot of Italian contacts in my WhatsApp. And so it's fascinating to me to you know, to see this differentiation. I would like to know, you know, what you think about like this. You know, I know that you said that, you know, the cross-cultural dimension is one of those dimensions that need to be explored further. But if you have any insights, that would be really interesting to know. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really relevant, and I think you also mentioned a complicating factor. So it's not only cross-cultural, but sometimes also cross-platform analysis that one has to conduct there. That's what I try to do with Duan Liji from Xi'an University in China. We also collected like a very small corpus of voice messages in Chinese, but there we have the problem, it's voice messaging, but it's a completely different messenger, which does not allow for voice messages longer than 60 seconds. So we also have to take the affordances into account. But we see that voice messaging, it is used, but it's not very popular. So people tend to write rather than speak, and they tend to use ultra short voice messages. So they have the 60-second limit, but they never actually get there. So private voice messages there are really, really short, just 1 or 2 seconds long, and then that's it. But what we also see then is that we get chunks. So they send several second-long voice messages, one after the other. And we also see that messengers are used in different contexts. So what we also have in that small corpus is voice messages sent by a university lecturer to their students to give feedback to a paper. And there we find messages that are 60 seconds long and several messages in a row. So you get something like a 3.5-minute feedback on your paper via voice message. So this opens up numerous questions in terms of how are messengers integrated into daily lives. So in Germany, we would not use messaging with teachers or lecturers at a university, say usually, but in China, it's completely normal. We also have cross-linguistic things. So how does language actually play into this? Plus, we also have the cross-platform challenge, so to say. How do we account for that? But yes, it's a fascinating field of study that needs more research.
Thank you.
Yes, that's fascinating. And we could also ask whose language ideologies. So from what national context do language ideologies diffuse globally? I have Alexandra Georgakopoulos on the list. Alexandra, would you like to pose your question? Yes, floor is yours. You have to unmute yourself, so.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much for a really very thought-provoking talk. I was just imagining, you know, when I was writing this long, I can see long, there's long in text as well, long question. I was just imagining a world not too far away where the conventionalized thing might be to say, send me a voice message. Because what I was thinking, and in a way with your last slide about emergent and reconfigured genres, you kind of, as it were, you know, began to cover this for me, was that what you're doing, which is fascinating, is also documenting a communicative practice on the rise. And it has been on the rise because of technological affordances. And I think that to my mind, the two key technological affordances that have enabled this rise is first a shift away from textual environments that we have seen on every single platform since their inception. And secondly, a kind of a shift towards posting on the go, you know, when you make that cup of tea. So it seems, well, technologists say that voice messages are here to stay. And I guess the observation / question is how much of what you're finding is actually integrally linked with this emergence and gradual consolidation of normativities.
Yeah, I'd say it's
a genre that's on the rise.
Yeah, it's interspersed with all of that what you actually pointed out. So the mobility aspect, for example, that you raised there, that's something that I was wondering about when I first traveled to China. At one airport, they had something on the floor. They had stickers that said, "Don't only look at your mobile phone." So because people ran into each other all the time because they did that. So what they did is text in on the move. And now we have the possibility to speak on the move, which at least, again, opens your eyes for other people around you. So yeah, that's a practice that has emerged. I need to do this on the move. And now all of a sudden I can do this on the move, so I can talk and look around me. That's also something that I hear in the voice messages in my corpus. You can hear people moving. They might breathe louder. You can hear background noise moving to and fro. So that's something that's in the practice. The other thing, of course, is what is it that people use voice messages for compared to text messages? So sometimes it can be just, a situational factor. I'm not able to type, but I'm able to speak. Sometimes it might be the other way around. I'm in a seminar and I cannot reply via voice, so I'll just have to type a message. But sometimes I'd say it's also related to what is being done, to the action that is performed, and that's where genres come in. So what I find repeatedly is something like a narration of my day. So people summarize what they did on that day, and they send that off as a voice message to their friends. And when I go through the transcriptions, they explicitly remind me of letters that people sent some years ago. So it's just like, tellings of the day, and they can be quite extensive. So I have a 9-minute posting in my corpus, but of course you need special circumstances for that. So in that case, it was 2 students living miles apart. So they are not like in direct contact, but they do that to update themselves. So there are new practices that emerge because of situational factors, but also because of, say, more personal factors, like where do you live at the moment? So it's a practice that's closely interwoven into all of these aspects.
Well, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. That's also a very good reminder that these new practices are due to technological affordances, but they are not determined by technological affordances. So people do different things with the same affordances depending on social context, institutional context. We have another couple of questions, and I'm happy to take both. And we can go beyond for a few minutes. That's okay, if that's okay with the audience. If not, please leave, but we'll terminate at about 5 past. I have Michal with another question. If you would like to take the floor, please.
Hi, Michal. So good to see you.
I would like first to thank you for this brilliant talk. I enjoyed it so much and learned so much. This is incredible research. I have just one quick question about, so you made one comment that was very intriguing for me. You mentioned that when participants are engaged in kind of a quick interaction, they would opt for texting rather than voice messaging. And this is kind of, it ties with an intuition I had for this, that, paradoxically, while these are spoken oral discourse, they are more tailored for, actions that are less interactional, less response eliciting immediately, whereas with texting, we are doing more collaboration. So yeah, I know, thoughts.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because it sort of touches upon this whole issue of temporality, right? So we have, let's say, from the affordances side, if you produce a voice message, the other one will need at least the same amount of time to listen to that voice message. But now, of course, we know that we can, use up to double speed to play them, which again reflects a practice of actually sending very long voice messages and the need to, speed up these things. But still, you need time to process the message. So that in a way makes it slower just by the affordances themselves. But the other thing again is, I think, a practice thing. So what do people think they can use voice messages for compared to text messages? So whenever you have this near synchronous mode, we have disrupted adjacency or phantom adjacency. So these things happen if things get quite quick. But I just don't see that with voice messages, because they sometimes also, just involve other activities like, tellings of the day and stuff like that, which is in itself meant for, say, larger time gaps. And there's no need to really respond as quickly as for example, expected with the text messages. And again, what the users also bear in mind is the fact that the contents of their message are not visible and not easily accessible for the others. And, you need to be able to play those voice messages. And if you think, for example, of seminar situations or something like that, you cannot, do that right away, which is, again, something that might differ according to the platform you use. WeChat, for example, has an automated transcription module, so you can display voice messages as text messages, and Chinese people tell me that it's actually working, so it's actually quite good. We don't have that for WhatsApp yet, I'd say. There are apps that can do that, but you have to forward the message to that app and then go back to WhatsApp. So it's not yet integrated into the framework, but that, of course, might be something that's coming up. So it's a moving target, so to say. We need to keep that in mind too.
Thanks.
Thank you. And let's take a quick last question by Tayane, whom I have on the list. If you would like to ask your question, Tayane, please speak up.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Katharina, for your talk. Your work has been very inspiring to me. I'm also working with CA and IL, and I have been analyzing WhatsApp interactions and also text messages or interactions in a tandem app where adults are learning languages, but at the same time dating, getting to know each other, etc. And I have more of a comment rather than a question, I guess. But in my data, what I see is that voice messages, they tend to happen later on as people get to know each other better. So, and it seems to be a pattern like that I observe also what you referred earlier about imposing on others. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on how perhaps matters of deontics and how, as the relationship develops and participants' deontic status change in relation to each other, how that impacts the choice of the mode. Yeah.
That's actually a very fascinating question for research. So to keep the communicative history in mind. So I mentioned that in one comment in my talk, something like, well, voice messages first need to be established as a acceptable mode of communication. So that sometimes happens in voice messages. So people say something like, I hope it's okay that I don't send a text. So sometimes they refer to that, but it's not often that I find that in my corpus. But I think that's just based on my method of data collection. So I ask people, are you willing to donate dialogues with voice messages? And what they do is they give me chunks where this has already been established. So it would be really, really interesting to follow, say, one dyad or a group chat over a certain amount of time and see how they get actually introduced as an acceptable mode of communication and how that is done, and how other group members, for example, pick that up. So that's an interesting perspective. But I guess, speaking for myself, I would need different data, but maybe you find that in your data, and that would be really, really interesting to see how that happens.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Time is up for today. Thank you to the audience for your great questions and the discussion and for sticking around. And thank you to Katharina for the exciting, very rich lecture, which will be recorded like all the others and made available on our repository. Join us again if you so wish. And if you're not on vacation, on July 7th, again, a Thursday afternoon for another lecture by Caroline Tagg.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye.